Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 361. I'm your host, Barney Smith of Storycomic.com, and we're honored to have with us the nationally acclaimed writer and celebrated academic, Brent L Kendrick.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, Barney, so much. I'm really honored to be on your podcast, and I want to take a moment and just salute you for focusing on Vermont artists and authors. You know, artists and authors live a lonely life, and they don't get to be in the limelight often. So I think you're doing a wonderful job with your podcast, and I salute you and I thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I was really excited to track you down, and when we were talking a couple months ago about getting you on, because you're as you say, you're Vermont author adjacent in the sense that you talk to us about Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. So this is a book that's been how many, like 200 years in the making? Is that it, or
100 or so? But hey,
100 or
Barney,
so?
doesn't that book feel good?
Yes, it's
Yeah,
nice.
I mean, it really does. But you know, you're providing me with a wonderful way to approach this Vermont writer, and notice the emphasis is on Vermont, because I can tell that if I had visited you in Vermont as a researcher, the way I do when I go off doing research, you know, I stop people, I knock on doors, and I introduce myself briefly. And I say, I'm here doing research on Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. And the immediate response is always, who? And I'm kind of amused by that, because by the who part, because she really, in her lifetime, she and Mark Twain were America's most beloved writers. And that's saying a lot. I mean, that's
Right.
huge.
Yeah.
That's a huge. And she was in her lifetime a household word. She was in the national press, not just the press in Vermont, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. She was in the national press almost on a daily basis. You know, I'm not going to liken her to Oprah Winfrey, but her name was a household name in her lifetime. You know, and I would say, you know, probably today, Marjorie Rowlings, Margaret Atwood, George Sanders. I mean, she was well known. And people today, you know, it's changing. It has changed in the last 30, 40 years. But, you know, they still largely ask who. And I proceed to tell them, and I'll, depending on, and I'll share with you why I think that that's the case these days, why people still say who. And that's why I brought out Green Mountain Stories. But I'll share with them, you know, the fact that, you know, imagine you're a woman writer, particularly a woman writer, and you start your career, you know, in the late 1870s, early 1880s. By 1883, she was 35 years old and 32 years old, and her mother and father were dead, and her brother and sister were dead, and she was alone in Brattleboro, Vermont. And her dad had been a businessman, owned a dry goods store on Main Street. And so when he died and she was left alone, she had $869 in cash, and she had half of his ownership of the business. And she kept that. And she turned to writing. And, you know, she told people late in life that she never wanted to be a writer. She wanted to be an artist. And she couldn't afford paints and paper, but she said, I had pencils. And so I started writing. And so imagine that 1883, and you're a woman and you're alone, and you don't have anybody in the family to back you. You know, and she turned to writing, and story after story after story flowed from her pen. You know, and the output of her work really is by any standards is just absolutely astronomical. You know, something like 24 volumes of short stories, 14 novels, 3 volumes of poetry. She did a motion picture play, you know, and so she kept on writing. And when she died in 1930, so let's do the crosswalk here. You start out with $869 and half an interest in your dad's business. and you die in 1930 at the height of the Depression. She didn't have a will, and everything got auctioned off. And even at auction value, it brought almost $250,000, which today would be like $2.3 million. That's an
Wow.
incredible success story, just in and of itself. So I tell people those things, and they start moving from the who to the wow. Wow. I mean, why haven't I heard of her? And to throw some other wow factors in there, in 1925, the American Academy of Arts and Letters awarded her the first William Dean Howells Gold Medal for distinguished work in fiction. That is a huge honor. I mean, it's huge.
Wow.
Still given. It's given every 5 years. She was the first. It has gone to writers like Willa Cather, who was born here in Virginia, Pearl Buck from West Virginia, William Faulkner, Richard Powers, John Updike. I mean, it's just such an honor. So that was 1925. Then in 1926, the American Academy, the National Institute of Arts and Letters, inducted her and made her a member. And that was a major breakthrough for women, because up until that time, Julia Ward Howe had been a member. They had made her a member in 1908. But until 1926, the National Institute of Arts and Letters was male dominated. There were no women in it. She was one of the first three women who were given membership. That's huge. That's another wow factor. And then in 1938, and I'm flabbergasted by it, delighted by it. But in 1938, the American Academy of Arts and Letters built a new building, and the huge bronze doors. I mean, they must several stories high. And across the top is an inscription dedicated to the memory of Mary E. Wilkins Freeman and the women writers of America.
Wow.
That's huge as well. So, depending on where I am, when I'm in Vermont, I'll say, "What do you mean you don't know Mary E. Wilkins Freeman?" And truly, I think anybody interested in the American short story tradition needs to know Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. I think everybody in the state of Vermont ought to know who this woman is, because she started her career there. I mean,
Right.
she was 15 when she moved there with her family, and she stayed there until well, it's hard to say. She started going back to Randolph, Massachusetts around 1883. She was born in Randolph, but she kept the property in Brattleboro, and she went
Mm.
back and forth. So it's kind of hard to say exactly when. But by 1887, when her first collection of short stories was published, A Humble Romance, she was in Randolph, Massachusetts, where she was born. So if I'm in Vermont, I go that angle. If I'm in Randolph, I go the angle of, well, she was born here. And then, she moved back to Randolph in around 1883 or so. And she stayed there until 1902, when she married a doctor who lived in Metuchen, New Jersey. And so she lived in Metuchen from 1902 until 1930, when she died.
Mm.
I think part of the problem, and please interrupt me with questions anytime you want to. I think part of the challenge with why she isn't, well, there are a number of reasons, but born in Massachusetts, developed and launched her career in Vermont, moved back to Massachusetts, then married a guy from New Jersey and lives there until she died. So what state rightfully claims her as her own? And for me, it's a no-brainer. I mean, it truly is. It's a no-brainer, because I think the state that rightfully claims any writer is the state where that writer lived during those formative years when she was developing her career. And without a doubt, that was Vermont for her.
Mm.
By the time she came out with A Humble Romance and other stories, she was already a nationally acclaimed children's writer living in Brattleboro, Vermont. I mean, she was in national magazines like Wide Awake magazine. She was in Century magazine. In 1883, Daniel Lothrop and Company in Boston brought out a children's collection called Decorative Plaques, and plaques as in pictures. Keep in mind, she wanted to be an artist. And so Daniel Lothrop and Company sent her these pictures, 12 pictures, and for each picture she wrote a poem, and that came out. It's a beautiful book. It came out in 1883, and as I recall, not that I was around then, but looking back at the prices for what the book sold for, that book sold for around $3 in 1883. That was fairly pricey, but it's a beautiful, it's an art book almost, if you will.
Right.
I landed a copy of that a few years ago, and I don't mind saying I paid $1,500 for it. You won't find it on the market these days. So she was already an acclaimed writer, and so here she comes out, with the collection of stories for adults. She did that crosswalk. She had been a children's writer, and keep in mind she was a single woman having to earn her living. And so you're obviously going to reach out to a market that pays more. And she started reaching out to Harper's Bazaar. And Mary Louise Booth accepted her first story that she sent there called Two Old Lovers. And it's in Green Mountain Stories. That story has I'm especially fond of that story because the original manuscript of it survives, and written at the top in her horrible handwriting, but you can tell, written across the top is Brattleboro. So she wrote that first story, her first one for adults. She wrote it in Brattleboro. Story after story flowed from her pen. And after a few years, she had no stories to collect. Harper and Brothers wanted to do a collection of short stories.
Well, hey there. If you're enjoying our podcast, don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Your support means the world to us and helps us keep this show going. We love hearing from you, so any feedback is welcome. And thank you for being a part of our podcast family and for all your support. It truly means a lot to us. Green Mountain Stories, this is now, it's finally been published under its intended title.
Yes.
And you have some great extensive critical commentary at the beginning of it. So
right.
What significance does this hold for Freeman's legacy and for, say, Vermont's literary history?
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. That's a great question. I think it has a tremendous, and that is largely why I brought out Green Mountain Stories. And the book itself, the backstory behind the book, Green Mountain Stories, is as fascinating to me as the backstory behind Freeman's, getting the book published at last under the intended title. So she wanted it published. She didn't like the title Humble Romance. And she wrote to her editor, Mary Louise Booth, and told her that, here, imagine Harper and Brothers, you know how the publication business works. There can be slippages. And so Harper and Brothers, and she's dealing with Henry Mills Alden at Harper. But her editor really is Mary Louise Booth. And she writes to Mary Louise Booth and says, the book's coming out and I hate the title. I'd rather write a story than write a title. And so Mary Louise Booth wrote back and said, well, why don't you call it Green Mountain Stories? And Freeman, who was then Mary Wilkins, replied, and she said, oh, I love that title. And I suppose it won't matter, will it, that I haven't mentioned, as far as I recall, any mountains in the story. And she hadn't really. But Mary Louise Booth suggested Green Mountain Stories because that's where this new writer, she was a rage across America and in Great Britain as well. That's where the writer started her career, was in Vermont. So yeah, Green Mountain Stories made perfectly good sense. So that was what they agreed upon. This has a really delightful twist, in my opinion, as a researcher. Mary Louise Booth sets sail for France and is gone on a vacation for a month. The book, in the meantime, is hitting the press. It's being printed. So advertisements for the book are all over the place. Some newspapers advertised it as Green Mountain Stories. Others advertised it as A Humble Romance and Other Stories. Other newspapers advertised it as A Humble Romance and Other Green Mountain Stories, but it didn't get printed as Green Mountain Stories. And that's what she and Miss Booth had agreed upon. So I guess Mary Louise Booth should have stayed at home and finished her editorial work rather than traipse off to France. I think she went to France. So when I edited Freeman's letters back in 1985, that comment in her letters fascinated me. It really did. And when I brought out the Infant Sphinx, collected letters of Mary Wilkins Freeman, her letters had never been collected, and so I spent 10 years traipsing around all over the country to 50 libraries, and I was fascinated by that. But you know how life is. You finish a book and you go on to something else. But I kept doing my research on Mary Wilkins Freeman, and I really thought that edition of letters would change things some. And I think it has actually. I mean, any time you writers' letters have been edited and published, any scholar doing work on that writer has to consult the letters or look fairly stupid. And so I think that it has helped bring Freeman into public attention more. It's heightened her awareness. And I'll go back to that in a minute. But nonetheless, despite that, in all of my talks, and I go all over the place, anytime anybody will invite me, I go off talking about Mary Wilkins Freeman. I've been to Brattleboro. I was thinking before our call, last year around this time, I was in Vermont. Green Mountain Stories was launched in Burlington. And then a few days later, I was invited down to Brooks Public Library in Brattleboro, and they hosted a book signing and a talk. But even still, when I go back to even Vermont, people will say, who? And that troubles me. And so when I started my process of reinvention, I thought, okay, I'm going to turn back to that letter. This is my opportunity to bring out A Humble Romance under its intended title, Green Mountain Stories. And I did that deliberately for several reasons. One, it was her intent. Two, I really am hoping that Vermonters, at least, and maybe your podcast will instill a degree of Puritan guilt, if nothing else, and make Vermonters want. I think it has nothing to do with the sell of the book at all. It has to do with my hope for greater awareness of who this Vermont writer is. I think every household in Vermont ought to have a copy of Green Mountain Stories. I think every school in Vermont should, every library in Vermont should. I'm being serious with this. And I think that shame on any educator in Vermont who doesn't figure out a way to incorporate a free open educational resource short story. They're all online. They're all free. They need to be teaching Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. Kids love her, even her adult stories. My specialty is American literature, and obviously I'm not going to teach any class in American literature if it covers the 19th century and not include Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. And more often than not, I'll teach her story, A New England Nun. Students absolutely love that story. When I get in the classroom, I'm always auctioning away the literature, and we may be studying 2 writers that day or 3, and I'll begin class with, so for New England Nun, Mary Wilkins Freeman's New England. Anybody give it a 10? And I might get a 10. Not generally. I might get a couple. How about a 9? I keep going. And I forget it. Well, what do you need to get it to a 10? But they like that story an awful lot. So I think that educators can and should include Freeman in what they teach, because she is a Vermont writer. In my opinion, with all due respect to all other Vermont writers, she's the most important Vermont writer ever.
You're also working on a second book about Mary E. Wilkins Freeman's, right? Dolly?
I am.
Something like that?
Yeah, I
Okay.
am. So I did the collected letters in 1985. And that's pre-personal computers, pre-internet. And so
Mm-hmm.
locating letters really required writing to libraries, going to libraries to visit, because I couldn't always get photocopies. And so I made a truthful claim in that book that the infant sinks included all known 517 Freeman letters that I had tracked down, and it did. More letters are surfacing. Libraries have greater abilities to inventory and catalog collections that have not been inventoried before. So over the last 10 years, probably I have found already, I'm guessing, 60 more letters, really important letters. And my first thought was, okay, I'll do an updated edition of the Infant Sphinx. But I have also uncovered so much new biographical information that I thought this will never,
Mm.
because the Infant Sphinx is already huge. I've forgotten how many pages it is, but I'm reaching to get my copy. It's a
It's look
big
like it's
book,
517 pages.
517 letters. But
Okay.
Barney, that's and I'll answer that, and then I'll go back to the 2-volume book I'm working on now. 517 letters is pitiful for a
Right.
writer who lived, born in 1852, died in 1930. Someone as prolific as her, and she had lots of friends. That's not a lot of letters. But during my years of research, the sad story that I came across and heard over and over again. Oh no, those letters were far too personal. Mama burned them, or we lost those when we moved. And so a lot of letters seemingly have just kind of disappeared. I bought one, I'm thrilled to have it. I found it on eBay just 3 or 4 weeks ago. I tipped into a book, Jane Fields, which is one of her novels, and I love that novel. Actually, I'm delighted. But this is beautiful. It's a double association book because it's the book that Thomas Hardy owned, and it's in from his library with his book plate in it. But tipped into it is a letter from Mary Wilkins Freeman to Thomas Hardy. So letters like that keep bubbling up. I'm not certain where they've been or where they're coming from, but there's so many that obviously I can't do. I can't do a new updated edition of the Infant Sink. So it's a labor of love, and I figure if I've fussed around with this woman for 50 years, I can put up with her for another 10. So I'm working on a 2-volume book, and I'm calling it Dolly. I'm using that title Dolly because that's what her friends called her. She was a
Oh,
very
cool.
petite, yeah, she was a very petite woman, only around 5 feet tall, very thin, had a beautiful, massive head of hair, brunette, kind of blondish, reddish color. She loved her hair. She was very vain. I mean, she really was. She was exceedingly feminine. And people that I met in Metuchen who knew her during the Metuchen years would say to me, "Oh, I can't imagine Dolly Freeman walking across the floor. She floated along." And the fact that, and they would say the eternal feminine was about her. So I like the name Dolly. That's what her friends called her. I think she's looking down smiling. So I'm going to call it Dolly, Life and Letters of Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. Volume 1 will be the New England years from 1852 to 1902. And then Volume 2 will be the New Jersey years, 1902 until 1930. It's a massive undertaking. I mean, it is a massive undertaking, but I'm thrilled to be doing it. And, every day is a good day for me if I uncover, and I work on Freeman every day, but if I uncover something new, even if it's small, small things are what biographers love. And I love
Mhm.
all the little details. Not too long ago, I found a newspaper, and this shows her popularity. I found a newspaper article Imagine this being in the press, that she had gone to somebody's wedding and you wear something borrowed, something blue. I don't know what the saying is. And she wore a pair of blue stockings that she had worn as a teenager to this lady's wedding. Those details just absolutely fascinate me. So
Right.
yeah, the volume book. But I want to go back to for a minute to Green Mountain Stories and what really makes the book so special, in my own opinion. From the time that I came up with the idea of doing Green Mountain Stories, because it is her permanent anchor to the Green Mountain State, to Vermont, I was adamant that I would not let any publisher have the book other than a Vermont publisher.
Mm.
Well, when you're trying to market a writer where people say who, that's kind of hard. I mean, you can't. It's kind of hard to do. But I was really fortunate, and I landed. So, not only is this a Vermont writer, but Green Mountain Stories truly is made in Vermont. The publisher is Onion River Press. I had the great joy working with Rachel Fisher and Sophia Wright. So it's Onion River Press out of Burlington. The designer, Jenny Lyons, is a Vermonter. And I just love that book. I fell in love with the cover and what Jenny did, and she was just great to work with. So the publisher is Vermont, the designer is Vermont. It got launched in Vermont, and I keep pushing it in Vermont. So I really do think that from last year forward, anybody doing research on Mary E. Wilkins Freeman has to at least grapple with my assertion that she is a Vermont writer. She rightfully
Right.
is. Um, let me add. You'll like this maybe. So, her estate was auctioned off very quickly when she died in 1930. But the very last thing to be sold by auction was her half of the property in Brattleboro, Vermont. She was an incredible businesswoman. She kept that property all down through the years and rented it out as apartments, to pharmacies, to beauticians. That was the very last thing that was sold in 1930. And I love the fact that it was bought by the Brattleboro Home for the Aged, because her two childhood friends, Allie Morse and another childhood friend, Evelyn Sawyer Severance, both had, by 1930, they were old, and they had moved to the Brattleboro Home for the Aged. So I thought it was kind of appropriate that they ended up
Mm.
buying that piece of property.
Yeah. So perfect. So Brent, if people want to learn more about you and your work, where's the best place they could go to?
My work on Freeman?
Well,
Well,
just you as an author in general as well.
yeah. So I would suggest my blog as a good place. That's what you have up there, the tyranny of right now. I mentioned I do the blog, but the blog has all of my past blog posts in it. It has an about me section in it. It has a contact me, and so they can certainly learn a lot about me and what's going on there. They can also find these books. So I write these blogs very quickly. I write these weekly, and I never intended to publish them. I really didn't. And
Hmm.
I have probably not followers, but I had last year almost 8,000 viewers, which is
Okay.
pretty good. Uh, and so I thought, well, with this many people viewing my blog posts, I'm going to publish them. So I brought out volume one in 2023 as part of the Wired Researcher series, because my blog is called thewiredresearcher.com. And it's part of the Wired Researcher series. And volume one is called In Bed, My Year of Foolin Around. And that always causes people to have a lot of whiplash, because they're expecting, something maybe a little risque. And possibly it
Right.
might be, but I called it that simply because, thank you. Yeah, there it is. Both of them. I call it In Bed because I write them in bed, and I like to be playful. So And then last year I brought out the second volume, More Wit and Wisdom, another year of fooling around in bed. And yeah, there will be a volume three. So that's a good place. And those are available on Amazon. They're available in all formats, Kindle, ebook, and paperback and hardback. They're also
Right,
available through Barnes and Noble, and certainly Green Mountain Stories is available there as well,
right.
under my name or Freeman's name. And that,
Yeah.
there you go. And that isn't that that's just such a great book. It really is. And that can be
Yeah, that was a
purchased.
great cover.
I love
Yeah.
that cover, and I just love feeling that that can be purchased as well through Onion River Press.
So people want to learn more about you, Brent, they can go to thewiredresearcher.com.
Yes,
And yeah, this has been great. And so listen, when you come out with Dolly, or if you come out with more of your year in bed, um, yeah, come back on. This has been great, Brent. This has been a great conversation.
I've enjoyed it immensely, and again, I thank you. I have to say this, Barney, because every time I'm in Vermont, and I'm not in Vermont now, but I am through you, and I'm looking to be adopted. Because I really want to be called a Vermonter. So it seems to me, after 50 years of working on a Vermont writer, that
Right.
somebody ought to adopt me or give me honorary Vermont citizenship or something like that. So yeah, I'd love
Right.
to come back on.
Yeah.
I love
Yeah.
talking about Mary
Perfect.
Wilkins Freeman. I love talking about literature, but she is a phenomenal writer. I focus largely on my fascination with her life and my fascination with her as a businesswoman. But when it comes to the American short story tradition, in my opinion,
Right.
she is right up there with Mark Twain. She's right up there with Stephen Crane. She's right up there with Sarah Owens Jewett, Nathaniel Hawthorne. She's better than Poe, in my opinion. And interestingly enough, her ghost stories and stories of the supernatural are hot items these days. She's really good. She has some
Oh,
stories that even deal with time travel, which is
oh,
kind of
cool.
fascinating to me.
Right.
So she's a great writer, and I think if anybody likes short stories, and if they like a writer who knows how to explore the psyche of people who are ordinary, common folks, but also who can be rather twisted,
Huh?
they won't do better than to read Mary Wilkins Freeman. I've always maintained that
Mm,
had it not been for Mary E. Wilkins Freeman, we would not have had, and it's a big claim, but I'll stand by it. If we had not had Mary Wilkins Freeman, we would not have had the likes of Sherwood Anderson, who did Winesburg, Ohio, and we would not have had the likes of William Faulkner, because
wow.
she paved the way for writers to be bold enough to explore normal, everyday people who have twisted psyches, and she knew how to do that, and readers liked it, and so I recommend her. If you like the short story tradition, you have to read Mary Wilkins Freeman.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much. This has been great, Brent. I appreciate your time.
Absolutely, thank you, Barney. Again, I salute you for the work you're doing.
Yeah. I saw I saw that with your second
Yeah,
book. Yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah.
you're
So
gonna
I
do a
do
third
those
one
just
too.
for your own amusement. I do those in bed.
Yeah.
On my smartphone. It's the last thing I do of the day, and I refuse to work. I've got three computers in three different locations, but for my blog post, I do it in bed only, and I lie there and I write until I'm ready to quit. And I start at 8 and religiously, and
Yeah.
sometimes I write until 10. And the other night I got really going and I wrote until 11:20. And I love doing it that way. It's a commitment to writing, and I do
Right.
it 7 days a week without fail. And I have always told my students, and now I'm applying it to myself, if you want to be a writer, just write. And it requires
Right.
commitment.
Right. Cool. All right. Let me get the let me get the intro in